Welcome back live, ladies and gentlemen. It's the Mythological Milwaukee Show. I'm your host, Rob Moore, here as always. But today, with special guest, Antonio. What's up, Antonio?
Very good, very good.
Brian on assignment this week in Parts Unknown, investigating the secular movement for us here at the Mythicist Milwaukee. We're coming to you as always from the Grand Avenue Mall, the Bucket Works location here on the second floor. Stop by. We're always listening to the show in the back room and contributing. You can listen to us on Periscope, Meerkat, and Mixler. Hit the chat button and join the conversation. We are talking today to a very special guest from Lake Forest, Illinois. He's a cultural historian, a mythologist, and a prize-winning author who at the end of 2013 retired from a 30-year career as an international lawyer in order to devote his time to studying and writing and speaking about mythology and related subjects. He's a frequent speaker at scholarly conferences and other events on mythological, religious, and related topics. He is the author, along with his wife Elena, of 2 award-winning books, the latest of which is entitled The Mythology of Eden, a title by itself that's probably going to engender a little controversy, and just calling it mythology can be controversial, which was published last year. In it, he examines the biblical Garden of Eden story from the perspective of mythological studies, which will be the subject of today's discussion. He has a mythology blog at mythologymatters.wordpress.com and a website also at mythologymatters.com. Please welcome Arthur George. What's going on, Arthur?
Oh, I'm fine. Enjoying the holiday.
Take 2. Appreciate you jumping on and being patient here. We're going to get going right away. You call yourself a mythologist. How did you get interested in mythology, my friend?
Oh, it goes a long way back, starting probably in college. I've always been interested in cultural history and archaeology and religion as a human phenomenon. And so my interest in these disciplines, among others, such as psychology, all fell together nicely in the study of mythology. So that's what fascinates me in the last few years anyway, the most. And along the way, I've read a lot of mythology books, and Joseph Campbell in particular was an important influence on me, as he was for many other people.
Now, is Joseph Campbell what brought you necessarily to the mythology of the Bible? I know a lot of people like mythology growing up in school. I loved the easy mythology, the fun stories of gods gone by. What made the mythology of the Bible so interesting?
Well, it's a particular kind of mythology because for us it's more important than the other myths because they've directly influenced the course of our Western civilization and religion so much. Even today, we still live with these myths all around us. So it's important that we understand them and see how they still influence our society for better or worse, and then we can take a proactive stance in relation to them, drawing on the good messages and leaving the bad behind.
It seemed like the mythology in the Bible was fairly obvious to a logical being like yourself. Were you not indoctrinated as a youth? What was your religious upbringing?
It wasn't too much, actually. My parents were both Methodists, and they did send me to Sunday school for a while, and then that just sort of faded out, and I was left on my own, kind of. And then in college, I took all my studies seriously, and then became an agnostic, I guess, is the best technical term.
Mainline Protestantism is absolutely a breeding ground of atheism. Is where I came from. Go ahead, Antonio.
Yeah. Regarding the Garden of Eden, and your decision to write a book, why did you decide to write this book? And did you see other parallels, such as ancient Greek versions with golden apples and a serpent laid on themselves? Do you discuss parallels in your book, discussing the Garden of Eden?
Okay. Yeah. Well, just how the book came about. First, my wife and I share a curiosity about this subject, and we always wanted to dig into the Adam and Eve story and see what it really meant, especially since creation myths are the most foundational. And at some point, it was actually she who suggested that we make a book out of it. And as I hinted of already, I wanted to not just explain the myth as a historical matter, but also analyze how it still influences us today, such as in the Catholic doctrine of original sin, which says our sinful nature comes from Adam, and that in turn justified and provided the rationale for the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, and means for salvation and all that. So in that sense, the Eden story is even more foundational to our culture than the Christ story. Regarding about how what parallels I use, not so much the Greeks, but I draw a lot on the ancient Near Eastern civilizations, in Mesopotamia, the original Canaanites from before Israel emerged, and also from Egypt. So there's a lot of that in the book.
What is mythological about the approach to the Eden story that that you adopt in your book?
Well, like any myth, the Eden story is told using symbols, mythological symbols as its building blocks. In this case, they include the creation motif itself, our Garden of Eden itself, two sacred trees, a serpent, cherubim, flaming sword, and so on. And I think that in order to understand the story, you need to understand the symbols that were its building blocks. And so the approach I take in the book is to analyze the meaning of these symbols one by one, look at their traditional meanings in the ancient Near East in general, and then apply that to how the author of this story changed the traditional meanings of the symbols in order to make his argument.
So what are the meanings of those symbols that you've just mentioned now?
Oh, well, I think we'll have to go through those one by one because it's actually quite detailed. So I think we can probably do that as we go along rather than try and do it all at once.
So, do we know who wrote the Eden story? And we all grew up, and Moses wrote the entire Old Testament. Is how kind of we were taught, even as Methodists and Congregationalists and more liberal Protestant thinkers. Who wrote the Eden story? Yeah,
well, for centuries, people have suspected that Moses wasn't the author, and in the 19th century, German scholars were able to pick it apart and see which parts of the books of Moses were authored by particular people or sources, they call them. And so we were able to identify who was responsible for the Eden story, as well as many other famous Bible stories, such as Cain and Abel and the Tower of Babel and so on. And his writings are actually the oldest in the Bible. We don't know his name or anything, but we just call him the Yahwist because he was the first author in the Bible to use Yahweh as the word for God, beginning with the Eden story. Traditionally, scholars have dated this author to the 10th century, just after the time of Solomon. But over time, scholars keep dating him later, in part because there wasn't enough literacy in the 10th century to compose this kind of story. So in the book, I tentatively date the author to the mid-9th century, but he could be later than that. The main point is that he's the earliest of the biblical authors, which puts him at the beginning of the drive toward monotheism, which entails, obviously, opposition to other gods and goddesses that were venerated in Israel at the time.
Mm. Now, how does the Eden story in Genesis 2 and 3 relate to the creation story of 6 days in the first chapter?
Yeah, well, they're both creation stories, but actually they're entirely separate. The Genesis 1 story was written by a different author much later, maybe by as much as 2 centuries later. And that author is known as the priestly author, P for short, because his writings in the Hebrew Bible are so concerned with priests and their prerogatives and laws and so on. The Yahwist was not concerned with these things. So what we've got is 2 separate self-contained stories written by different authors at different times, and they differ in important substantive ways. For example, in Genesis 1, the author doesn't call God Yahweh, but the Eden story does. And also the order in which things were created differs in the 2 stories. In Genesis 1, first you have plants created, and then animals, and then men and women are created simultaneously, and probably many of them, not just a single pair. And in Genesis 2, which is the Eden story, you get first a man, Adam, and then the plants, which is the garden, and then animals, and then finally a single woman built from Adam's flesh. And I guess a final example would be the notion that man is created in the image of God appears only in Genesis 1, and it's absent entirely from the Eden story, in which humans are not elevated in this way. There, the humans are just made out of dirt, and they return to dirt when they die, and the very point of the Eden story is that humans should not try to be like God, because humans and God are fundamentally different.
Do you view...
So, I mean, these differences, people have tried to paper them over for centuries and say that, Genesis 2 and 3, the Eden story just fleshes out Genesis 1, filling in the details, and you still see that even in TV documentaries, but nothing could be further from the truth, because Genesis 1 wasn't written till later. And another example is Lilith, this idea of Adam having this first wife. This idea became possible because in Genesis 1 it refers to more than one woman, right? And then in Genesis 2, Eve appears ostensibly as the first woman. So people actually ask, well, who was this earlier woman in Genesis 1? But in the mind of the author of the Eden story, there was no such other woman, because the story that supposedly involved her had not been written yet. So the idea of Lilith really shouldn't play any role in our analysis of the Eden story.
Do you view the differences in the order between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 as a contradiction? And within Genesis 1, when God states things like, "Let's make mankind in our image, not in my image," do you view that also as a hint on polytheism versus the monotheism which Christianity seems to tout?
That particular point is not so contradictory as between the two accounts, because even in the Eden story, it says, we will be like gods, if we get this knowledge from eating the fruit. And I think both stories presume that there are other divine beings hanging around, and that's true really for Israelite religion in general. And the big contradiction in the stories, as far as humans are concerned anyway, is that the woman comes last and comes out of the man, so she's in a way derivative from the man.
You seem to imply that there was political concerns going on, and had some influence on this story. How does the Eden story relate to the political landscape in ancient Israel at the time of its writing?
Oh, yeah. This background's really important, and it gives us some understanding on what the religious issues would have been at the time, which this author wanted to write about and argue about. First thing is that the archaeology shows that Israel actually emerged out of Canaan. So originally, the Israelites were really mostly native Canaanites, and this means that their own religious traditions were really those of Canaanite polytheism. The Bible, of course, paints this picture of the Hebrews escaping from Egypt in the Exodus and adopting Yahweh as their single deity and conquering the Promised Land and killing most of the Canaanites. But the archaeologists have been all over this, and there's no evidence for any of it. The Bible portrays the Canaanites and their gods as foreign enemies, but the real story is more like the old line from Pogo that we have met the enemy and he's us. This is important because it means that the effort to establish monotheism entailed the Israelites exorcising their own religious traditions rather than staying away from foreign ones. And these traditions, as I say in the book, and I hope to go through, involved things like venerating sacred trees and serpents and goddesses who were paired with their husband gods. And these elements are present in the Eden story. Another Israelite background I should mention is that both of the creation stories in Genesis reflect the general concept for creation in the ancient world. And under this approach, creation involved not the creation of some substance from nothing, but rather it involved creating order out of a pre-existing, formless, disorderly substance. We often call it chaos. So nothing new was really created. The old substance was just shaped into a variety of new things. And so in Genesis 1, we see this where the pre-existing chaotic substance is these dark waters, and then God's Spirit hovers over it. And also in Genesis 2 we see it, but there the pre-existing chaos is a desert wasteland, and then Yahweh puts the Garden of Eden into that wasteland, which is creation. And so this notion of order and chaos is really important, because order is deemed good and chaos is bad. And in fact, sin itself is viewed as a form of chaos within the human mind. And I'll have more to say about that later.
So where did the Israelite God Yahweh come from? And then, of course, the follow-up question is, what religious issues emerged in Israel when he was introduced there?
Yeah, well, Yahweh was not originally the Israelite god. He was originally a sky god and a warrior god worshipped in a region to the south called the Midian. And that's a valley and the highlands surrounding it on both sides of the Araba River Valley that runs between the Dead Sea and down into the Red Sea. And according to the Bible, this is where Moses met the priest Jethro, and he married his daughter, and that's where he encountered the burning bush before he went back to Egypt to fetch the Hebrews. And although the Exodus story is a myth, there is a grain of truth to that account, because apparently Yahweh was introduced into the land of Israel by the leadership of some group or groups that migrated up from the Midian, where Moses had that was his hangout, supposedly. And so the leaders of these people, in the mind of Israelites, were probably the people who evolved into these heroic figures that we see of Moses and Aaron and Joshua. But think about what that means. It means that Yahweh was not the original God of... Rather, he was injected into their religion from the outside. And then Yahweh had to compete with the original Canaanite deities to find his place, and this is the process that we see at work in the Hebrew Bible, beginning with the Eden story itself. So, I mean, in Canaan and Israel originally, the chief god of the Canaanites was El, and his son Baal became the popular weather god who brought the rain. And then when Yahweh was introduced, El got merged into him, and El kind of disappeared.
So
Yahweh also competed with Baal to be the prevailing weather god, like we see in Elijah's famous rainmaking competition on Mount Carmel. And then there were goddesses in Israel whose functions Yahweh also had to appropriate. So Yahweh was a really busy god trying to take over from these other
We're
deities.
real interested in the goddess, in the missing goddess mythology. So who was that main goddess in ancient Canaan/Israel?
Yeah, that goes back to Old Canaan as well. Just like El was the main god in Canaan, his wife, the goddess Asherah, was the chief goddess. And originally she had lots of functions. She was like a sea goddess, among other things, and the protectress of sailors and fishermen. But later in the Israelite period, her functions had been reduced to being a kind of Mother Earth goddess associated with the earth and its vegetation, and also goddess of human fertility and birth. And she got associated with and was venerated at sacred trees at the religious sanctuaries. And as a result, her own symbol, actually, and cult object was a symbolic tree, which was called an Asherah, lowercase, which was really a carved wooden pole, kind of like a totem pole, which stood in these sanctuaries. And actually the Bible says that one of these Asherah poles stood in front of Solomon's temple for most of its existence, except it was taken down at times during the reigns of reformist kings like Hezekiah. And also, it's important that Asherah was associated with serpents because they symbolize the divine energy of force that produces life, which is what goddesses were the most responsible for. And we know that she was associated with serpents because we have a lot of clay plaques and metal pendants discovered by the archaeologists. I wish we could see them during this interview, but I think, Rob, am I right that we can't show them here on the live broadcast, but I think when we post this on your website and YouTube, we can include some of these images.
Yeah, that's right. Our videographer will edit that stuff in.
Okay, so at
great.
this point, obviously there's a transition here from the polytheistic ideas to monotheism. If we have Asherah as well, along with Yahweh. It seems that at this point we don't have a firm monotheistic idea here. So what was her relationship to Yahweh?
Well, actually, she ended up being Yahweh's wife or consort. As I mentioned, originally she was El's wife, but when El merged with Yahweh and Yahweh took over El's functions, the wife came along as part of the deal. And so there's actually good archaeological evidence for this spousal relationship. We have a lot of inscriptions that refer to, quote, Yahweh and his Asherah. There are some twin pillars in some temples, Yahweh temples, that appear to represent the pair, being the two pillars. And also, there was an Asherah pole that stood in Yahweh's sanctuary in Samaria, which was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. And as I mentioned, an Asherah pole stood right in front of the Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. So the monotheists wanted to make Yahweh the sole deity to be venerated, and they didn't like his traditional marriage to Asherah, so they tried to get rid of her. And I like to call this Yahweh's divorce. So the author of the Eden story was one of the first people trying to get rid of her, and this is part of the action that we see going on in the Eden story.
What's the reasoning behind that? Why would they try to get rid of her?
Well, they wanted Yahweh to be supreme, not challenged by any other goddess. He had to have all functions of divinity, and he was asexual. And if he's married to the goddess, then he's has a sexual nature to him. So the Eden story was written against the goddess. As I mentioned, Asherah was associated with both sacred trees and serpents, and she was especially popular among women who involved their menfolk in venerating her. And originally in the ancient Near East, Mother Earth goddesses were responsible for the crops, so they had their sacred gardens around their goddess sanctuaries, and from these gardens, the first fruits of the harvest were taken and eaten in rituals. And in the rituals, it was thought that by eating the fruit, you were actually consuming the body of the goddess and absorbing her divinity. So we can see that here that one aspect of Yahweh's prohibiting Adam and Eve from eating the fruit is a warning not to venerate the goddess. But originally, the sacred gardens were under the jurisdiction of goddesses, not gods like Yahweh, as in the Eden story. So all these traditional elements are present in the Eden story, and they would have been familiar to the audience at the time. But the story's author turned the traditional meanings of these symbols upside down in order to promote his agenda.
So within the Eden story, there are three key symbols that you discuss within your book, the sacred tree, the serpent, and Eve. Regarding the sacred tree, the sacred tree was not unique to Judaism or the Abrahamic religions. So what is it about these trees, what is it about these mythological trees that makes them symbols throughout many myths, such as this one? And what are their meanings?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The sacred trees are not particular to Israel. There's really a worldwide mythological motif. In the ancient world, you have to look at the cosmos, and the created world consisted of three tiers. There was our earthly world where we are, and then there's the underworld below, and the heavens are above. And trees were unique because they span all three of these tiers in the cosmos, and so their roots grow into the underworld, and their branches stretch toward the heavens, and so they actually penetrate into the divine realms above and below. And so, therefore, people thought that trees are conduits for accessing divinity in both directions. And so that's one reason why people venerated the sacred trees. Another reason is that the trees are really the tallest and most venerable living things on Earth. They live for many human generations, so they represent longevity. They're green, either all year or they grow new foliage each spring, and so they represent life and its preservation and renewal. And since life is divine, trees were associated with one or another deity or tree vegetation spirit, and in Israel this was Asherah. And then finally, because trees connect with the divine, naturally they're also oracles, and they're used in divination. And so they can be associated with divine knowledge and how to access it. And that's why we have a tree of knowledge in the Eden story. So in that story, the tree of life was a conduit of the life force, while the tree of knowledge was the way to access divine knowledge and the wisdom of the gods. And this is pretty familiar symbolism in the ancient Near East.
Tell us about the idea of the fruit that came from one. And I'm still unclear on the trees. I always thought, as a casual reader, even though I was a reader of the Bible for a lot of years, that there was one tree. People think of it as one tree. You're talking about two trees. And maybe explain again the difference between the trees and what kind of fruit they may have actually had on them.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two trees because that coincides with the notion of what is divine in the ancient Near East. Something divine had two attributes: immortality on the one hand and wisdom or knowledge on the other. And so the tree of life and the tree of knowledge symbolize these two prongs of divinity. And in the story, as it happened, Adam and Eve did attain to some degree the knowledge. And so in order to prevent them from being divine, Yahweh had to cut off access to the tree of life so they wouldn't be like gods. And so in this way, the story is really an etiology, explaining why we're not immortal and why we're not divine.
And what about the fruit itself? Is there any reason to assign a fruit to the fruit of knowledge? People think of it as an apple. Antonio mentioned the golden apple. If these stories are truly from the Near East or the Middle East, it probably weren't the apple trees. What's the nature of the fruit itself?
Well, the story doesn't say what kind of fruit it is. It for sure wasn't an apple, because that was not a common fruit in ancient Israel, and apples were not prominent in ancient Near Eastern mythology, although it does appear in Greek mythology. The idea that Eve ate an apple didn't come around till in medieval Europe, and that was because it formed a nice pun between Latin words for apple, which is malum, and bad or evil, which is malice. So that's how that came about. There are lots of possibilities for which fruit it is. I suspect the author just left it vague because each kind of fruit had its own sort of meaning and symbolism to it. But if I had to pick one, I'd say that the author was mainly aiming at the grape. The Hebrew word for fruit that he uses here is peri. It does include grapes. It's used for grapes, including in the story, you may remember, when Moses sent his scouts out to Canaan to see what was there, and they returned with this big cluster of grapes to symbolize that it was indeed a fertile land. And also in the story with Noah getting drunk from wine, you may recall, which was actually written by the same author of the Eden story. The ending of that story is his grandson Canaan is cursed, which is to say that the Canaanites are cursed. Okay, so the grape symbolizes Canaan and some of the bad aspects of it too. And in fact, in Canaan, and in Israel too, the main festival is the Autumn New Year's Harvest Festival. After the grapes and olives have been pressed, and in the celebrations, people drank wine, got drunk, cavorted in the vineyards, had sex. Worship the goddess, and people really thought that if they were inebriated, they really were in mystical union with the divine, and the grape was seen as magical. We still call alcohol spirits, right? But drunkenness is also a kind of form of chaos, and so in the Eden story, I think that the author may have been parodying in opposing this kind of traditional religious activity. And the trees, do symbolize Asherah. as I mentioned. The audience in the Eden story would be inclined to associate the trees with the goddess, and this is important because Yahweh creates both of the sacred trees. So he's in charge of them, not the goddess, and he's the source of the divinity that comes from them. So in the tree of knowledge, Yahweh commanded Adam not to partake of it, and that can be interpreted as a command not to engage in sacred tree veneration, which is the same as saying not to venerate Asherah. The author wants to say that Yahweh is the source of the divine wisdom that Adam and Eve gained from this tree. And with the tree of life, the story's audience would have associated this with Asherah too. In the story, this becomes clear that it's Yahweh's tree, not Asherah's, because at the end of the story, Yahweh puts his trademark cherubim, which are his animals, being placed in front of the tree to guard it. And so this connotes that Yahweh, not Asherah, is the source of life and fertility, and therefore is the deity that deserves.
Is this an attempt to enforce some misogyny or patriarchal society on the listeners, or it seems like you're leaning more towards just a solidification of the myth arc?
No, there's definitely a patriarchal and misogynist strain of here, and this comes out in other parts of the story that I can talk about. But yeah, definitely. That's one of the unfortunate legacies of the story.
So with regards to the serpent now, the symbolism within the serpent. Now we obviously, again, just like with the tree and the sacred tree of life, we see similarities within other ancient societies. We see Hermes with snakes on a rod. We see Asclepius. We see Moses changing his staff into a snake. So with regards to the Garden of Eden and the snake, what was the meaning of the serpent as a symbol in Israel at this time?
Yeah, well, the examples that you cited are really good ones because they illustrate how complex the symbolism of serpents is in that part of the world, and indeed that's the case worldwide. I think it's probably easiest to break it down into positive versus negative associations of the serpent. On the positive side, the serpent represented the creative divine force or life energy and was venerated as divine. The serpent was kind of like the force in Star Wars. And it's underground, chthonic, people call it, from within the earth, because that's where they live, and they hibernate in the winter, and they can access the divine plane of another world just like trees do. Another thing is that serpents shed their skin, which is called slough, and so they're a symbol of renewal and eternal life as in the cycle of seasons. And so women use serpents and in fact their slough in fertility rites. What we also see is, in a positive light, is serpents being guardians. This probably comes from eyes never being closed. And so it gets associated also with roots and trunks of trees and guards them. So it's natural that we would see a serpent lurking around and protecting the tree of knowledge. And so serpents and trees really work together with the goddess too. And so a sacred tree is actually the conduit of the divine serpent power. So serpents are also, associated with divination because they are sources of knowledge and wisdom. In fact, the Hebrew word for serpent, which is nachash, actually connotes divination. So here we can see how the serpent's connected with the transmission of the knowledge of good and evil.
Could you?
Go ahead. I was going to get into the negative side.
No, that's great. You did, and I'm going to follow up to that point. You did mention that the serpent was also looked at as a protector, and we see this with the Wajet in ancient Egypt, which was depicted as a cobra, where a lot of times it's shown upon the head of Ra in order to act as his protection. Now, in the story for Adam and Eve, and this is where you move into the negative aspect, we see that the snake in this story isn't necessarily a protector of the tree. Am I correct? In this case, the snake is being symbolized as the devil.
It's being as a negative connotation, but the protector of the tree motif is just it conjures up the traditional image is all. What the author wants to do is portray the serpent. He wants to call up the traditional, even positive symbolism, but what he really wants to do is portray the negative aspects. And the serpents, or similar monsters, bigger monsters, actually they represent the divine force, but that also means that they can represent the unrestrained and chaotic divine force when it's not controlled, and that's what primordial chaos is about. And in this aspect, the serpent is evil. So this is what we see in the creation myths, when you get this serpent or dragon monster, which has to be overcome by some kind of sky god in order to create the cosmos. And that's what's called the dragon fight motif. And this evil serpent just happens to be a goddess most of the time, or at least her proxy. And so the Eden story author used this negative aspect, and he parodied the traditional positive associations, which Yahweh appropriated, but then used the negative ones to make his arguments. And you mentioned the Wadjet being erect. That's an interesting point, because traditionally when the serpent was portrayed in a positive light, it was portrayed as being erect, at least to some extent, and that connotes the divine energy that's flowing through the serpent. Whereas in the negative portrayal, the serpents are usually horizontal in position. And we see both positions in the Eden story. When the serpent was talking with Eve, it had to be erect in some way in order to communicate with her at more or less at eye level. But at the end of the story, Yahweh punishes the serpent, by cursing it to crawl on its belly and eat dust for the rest of its life. So what we have is the serpent being portrayed not as divine and not as deserving any kind of veneration. Rather, Yahweh rules and possesses all divinity.
This is the connotation that I was left with as a Protestant and a liberal Protestant growing up, that the metaphor of the snake was directly related to its lowness. It wasn't even granted legs; it had to crawl along the ground. All of this positive connotation of the snake came to me later in my dealings in later life with other mythologies and meeting the mythicists here. So that's all new to me. The snake is the divine positive and the creator, and the eating its tail, to create a circle, and sloughing its skin too. Yeah. So interesting stuff.
It's all pretty complicated.
Regarding the snake, why does the snake choose? This is the other thing. We were always taught that this is part of the misogynism and part of the patriarchy, that women were too weak to resist the temptation that a stupid snake was foisting upon it. Why does the serpent speak with Eve rather than Adam?
I think actually what you just mentioned is part of the story here. Israelite women would have been particularly devoted to the worship of the goddess. That's just the way things were in the ancient world, and they would have had a certain influence on their husbands, drawing them at least to some extent into their own worship. And so women and their devotion to the goddess Asherah would have represented a stumbling block in the effort to establish monotheism. And this is the kind of role that Eve plays in the story. So it's natural that the serpent would talk with her, and then Eve, as the story goes, then gives Adam the forbidden fruit to eat. And in this regard, it's really important that in the Eden story, the only fault that Yahweh finds with Adam is that he had listened to his wife and ate the apple, after she had already done it. And this is actually probably a pun. Eve was made from Adam's rib, and in Hebrew the word for rib is tzilah. But this word also connotes stumbling. So Eve, though she's ostensibly designed as Adam's helper, she actually proves to be his stumbling block.
That's a fascinating bit of anthropology. I love that.
Yeah, well, Eve's name in general, that's just not her name. It's just one of what she was made out of. But her name has a lot of meaning too. At the end of the story, it says that Adam named his wife Eve because, quote unquote, she was the mother of all living. It's Yom Kol Hai in Hebrew. And in Hebrew, Eve's name is Chava, which connotes life and is most particular, therefore, to mothers and to goddesses. And scholars have determined that the word Chava is also related to the words for serpent in nearby Semitic languages, even in Persian. So here, too, we see a connection between the serpent and Eve, and therefore also with the goddess. And then as to the mother of all living, that phrase is actually a version of a typical epithet used for mother goddesses throughout the ancient Near East. So here, too, the author is alluding to the goddess and connecting Eve with her.
So we can, in that way, Eve symbolizes, in fact, the original goddess, Asherah, that you speak of.
That's exactly right. I mean, we can sum up. I think we can sum up mostly what we've been describing. We've got Eve's name and epithet point to the goddess. Both Eve and the goddess are associated with sacred trees and serpents in their veneration. The sacred garden, as I mentioned, was originally the goddess's precinct. Eve's actions in the story, which symbolize sacred tree and serpent veneration, are symbolic of the Canaanite religious practices that our author opposed. As I mentioned in the story, Adam's fault was that he listened to his wife, and this probably portrays goddess veneration as well as its derivative of Israelite men listening to their wives who worship Asherah. And then as for Eve, her punishment is to bear children in pain. And this is notable because in the ancient world, goddesses were deemed to bear their children without pain. And Asherah, of course, was, among other things, a birth goddess. So our author is setting up a contrast here, which is another jab at the goddess.
So now, moving on to chapters 4 and 9 in relation to evil and the knowledge of good and evil. According to the author of the Eden story, what is ultimately the nature of and cause of evil?
This is really important stuff. In the ancient world, evil actually had a cosmic nature. As I mentioned, the world was created by making order out of primordial chaos, and the underlying substance of both the chaos and the created cosmos, including humans, is the same. The only difference is that the created world has order to it, which is good, as Genesis 1 says. And then the cosmos really it exists as a kind of bubble or island, and outside of the cosmos, all this chaos, we think of it as primordial waters, chaotic waters, still exists. And so this chaos is always trying to infiltrate the created world. And in fact, there's always some chaos, some element of chaos in the natural fabric of the created cosmos, including with humans. So it's kind of like the law of entropy in modern science. Things will tend to more disorder if you don't do something about it. And so we get natural disasters like earthquakes and floods and droughts and hurricanes. I mean, these are all, people thought, manifestations of chaos. And the same thing is the case with human evil. Evil arises when a kind of disorder appears in our mind and we don't think straight, even if we know better. And this is what is being portrayed in the case of Eve in the garden, because the moment when the serpent appears, the audience knows that chaos has appeared and that something bad is going to happen. And the serpent's words in "eat the fruit" really symbolized the chaos going on in Eve's own mind as she was deliberating.
I want to remind the people that and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that these were originally written as talking, spoken only stories that predated any written language. Am I wrong about that? Or these were written as a way to communicate in the evening to the people around the fire?
Yeah, I think scholars agree that the Adam and Eve story, there's an oral tradition behind that, and it developed over time, being told and retold. And so the author that I'm talking about here, we don't really know how much of this is original to him and how much he just incorporated from the oral tradition. There may have been parts of the oral tradition that he didn't incorporate, and then there were probably some things that he added to it or reorganized. So he's really more of a compiler, I would say, than a author writing something from scratch.
Well, you reminded me the way you put it to the foreshadowing. I mean, the storytelling techniques that last today are apparent in these myths. The audience was prompted to understand what was coming next because the serpent was introduced into the story.
Yeah, that's right, because he was using the traditional symbols that everybody understood. So you didn't really have to talk about it so explicitly. People just understood.
Yeah, this is the nature of theater, even now through the age of Shakespeare, and every author has used this device from time immemorial.
Yeah.
Really,
that's right.
To realize that at one time that this is how this went is really fascinating to me. I want to remind everybody that you're listening to the Mythicist Milwaukee Show. We have about 10 minutes left talking to Arthur George, fascinating author, mythologist, and Lake Forest guy. I want to touch on, of course, we are Mythicist Milwaukee, and you call yourself a mythologist. Do you have a sense of the mythicist movement? Do you pay attention to people like Richard Carrier and Robert Price? And is there should we all call it mythology in your world? Is there what do you think about the term and the movement mythicism?
Well, I really like the mythicist movement because it's important in calling attention to the mythological nature of what we're brought up with, and making us think about it more critically, and that's what I think I visualize myself as doing that kind of thing by analyzing the myths allows us to take a proactive approach to them and take the good and eliminate, ignore the bad part of it. As far as the New Testament stuff, yeah, I'm aware of Carrier. I read his most recent book, actually, and I've read a lot of other mythicist stuff. And, yeah, there's a lot of stuff in the Bible that, in terms of being true or false factually is not true fact, but can still have meaning as myth.
We like to do a little segment we call Myth of the Day, where Antonio enthralls us with a selected myth, and I'm going to give it over to Antonio. Take it away, buddy. What do you got?
And I'll keep it in connection to our conversation here and then follow up with another question. So the Ouroboros is an ancient Egypto-Greek symbol depicting a serpent or dragon eating its own tail. The Ouroboros often symbolizes self-reflexivity or cyclicality, especially in the sense of something constantly recreating itself, the eternal return. It is believed to have been inspired by the Milky Way, as some ancient texts referred to a serpent of light residing in the heavens. While first emerging in ancient Egypt, where the earliest written cultural records exist, the Ouroboros has been important in religious and mythological symbolism. Within the Hebrew Bible, the serpent, in which we have been discussing here, the serpent of the Garden of Eden lured Eve with the promise of forbidden knowledge, convincing her that despite God's warning, death would not be the result. The serpent is also identified with wisdom in Genesis 3:1. So, what is the nature of the quote-unquote knowledge of good and evil that Adam and Eve acquired by eating the forbidden fruit, Mr. Arthur George?
Yeah, actually, it does end up relating to the Ouroboros as understood in depth psychology. And I will want to come back to that at the end. But in terms of the nature of the knowledge of good and evil, as the name suggests, it really is knowledge about good and evil. It's not about sex or something like this, like some people think. Most fundamentally, it's about what is the nature of good and evil and what causes it and how do you prevent it. And it means having this knowledge means that you understand the cosmic nature of good and evil, like I've described, order versus chaos, and realizing that human sin is a manifestation of that chaos. And this is important to achieve the good. And the Hebrew Bible actually, this is not a mystery. The Hebrew Bible actually describes the knowledge of good and evil in a fair amount of detail, what it is a mental capacity in the minds of mature adults who have it. Children don't have it, nor do like senile old people. And Israel's best kings, like David and Solomon, are described as having like the highest level of this. Children under the age of 20, according to Hebrew law, don't yet have this knowledge, and therefore they're not yet considered responsible for their actions and are incapable of committing sin. In the modern world, we call this not having legal capacity, which is why minors don't get convicted for crimes. So actually, this kind of thing is exactly what's going on with Adam and Eve. Because at first, before they had the knowledge, they would not have been able to understand Yahweh's prohibition against eating this forbidden fruit. But once they gained the knowledge, they could be responsible for their actions. And that's actually when they were sent out of the garden to live in the real world, because they were ready for it. So the garden really ends up being a metaphor for our minds. So in the end, the humans having the knowledge of good and evil is actually a good thing. And people are expected to use it and to understand it and to follow, use it to understand and follow Yahweh's commandments and laws, and which in themselves are forms of order designed to promote
Why
good.
didn't God just give us this knowledge to begin with? Why did humans have to get it by disobeying God?
Yeah, actually in Genesis 1, this knowledge is probably presumed from the beginning, but in the Eden story, I think he probably did it for literary reasons and didactic purposes. First, I think for the author it was important to depict to the audience raw, chaotic human nature and what happens naturally when this nature takes its natural course. It's chaos at work. So the question will be, how do you restrain that? Secondly, I think it was important to the author that Adam and Eve learn their lesson the hard way, so they could experience themselves firsthand both the pure chaos within themselves, which is evil, and then the coming of the corrective ordering knowledge, which is good. And this enables the audience, of course, to feel the same dynamic within themselves. So I think those are the reasons why he.
Why is there not a component? Is there not a component of the fire giver god, the Promethean type of figure who disobeys the higher god by bringing knowledge to the humans?
Yeah, I think the Prometheus myth is probably it's actually a very good analogy. Here we have a Titan, not a human really, but stealing something divine from the gods in order to help people and establish civilization. That's a good analogy.
We got about 5 minutes left. You want to wrap it up for us? What can we take away from this? How is the Eden story important for us today?
Well, I think actually this will take us to the Ouroboros point. I think one positive takeaway is the idea that the story is really about the elevation of human consciousness. When we realize this, we can see that it's incumbent on us to continue to elevate ourselves, and so that we can develop ourselves to a higher level and create a better world. And for this, it does help to turn to depth psychology, because the ancient notion that it is the chaos in the human mind that causes problems, we can now understand that in terms of the unconscious side of our psyche. Psychologists point out that water is a symbol for the unconscious. So when you see the ancient creation stories depicting a transition from this watery chaos into order, we can see a transformation in ourselves from our own semi-consciousness, from a lower, less conscious state into a full-fledged ego consciousness. And this more murky lower level of consciousness is really the psychologists call that the Ouroboros. And actually the garden itself can be viewed as a kind of Ouroboros where all this kind of happens, and then once they get the knowledge, they're out of it, and they're into ego consciousness. So this is important in order to develop our inner selves and our happiness. There's another positive takeaway, which is the ecological theme, because God tells Adam to take good care of the garden, which is the earth, and I think that's really an important theme these days when we're facing climate change and environmental challenges. There are a couple negative things, though, too, I'd want to mention. One is, as you already brought up, the Eden story has caused immense damage to women and their position in society over the centuries, and it's wrongly made them responsible for the evil in the world and authorized their domination by men, and we need to stop letting this myth justify that, even though some people still try and do so. And finally, there's another negative takeaway. The Eden story had this notion that there's no divinity in the world, including in humans, and that all divinity resides out there in Yahweh, the Father God. And this, too, I think, has caused us a lot of harm because it desacralizes the world. A lot of spiritual traditions, especially in Asia, teach us that we should be aligning ourselves with the forces and energies of nature, and now that physics tells us that everything is energy, I think that helps reopen the door to this kind of spirituality, which was closed off to us by the Eden story and the rest of the Hebrew Bible. So I think those are the main takeaways. If I'm hearing you right,
then the Christian notion, though, and you addressed this, or you kind of touched on it in the very beginning of our talk today, of original sin and the need for a redemption through Christ. Is this a further co-option of the true meaning of the Eden story, do you think, or is there a solid basis for that conclusion?
Yeah, there's nothing like original sin in the Eden story. It really was co-opted by early Christians. The transgression of Adam and Eve, it was an incident in a much longer story explaining how and why evil snowballed before the flood and how it was eliminated by the flood, and also ultimately why Hebrews came to need Yahweh's law of Moses. The Eden story doesn't involve any fall except for the fall of the goddess. Instead, it's really, as I mentioned, about the elevation of humans and their psyche from this primitive state to one where they could have a higher mental capacity to be good. In their original state, Adam and Eve would not have understood what sin is, which is why Yahweh never even bothers mentioning it to them. The first time you hear about sin and any lecture from Yahweh about it is when he counsels Cain. And that's because Cain already has the knowledge of good and evil because his parents had it. So logically, Adam and Eve's disobedience could not have risen to the level of sin any more than the actions of an Israelite child could.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And we see in the flood, as I mentioned, the flood actually washed away all the sin, just like a baptism, because in the flood, the created cosmos itself was eliminated except for Noah and the ark floating in this kind of bubble. And so sin was wiped away, and then right after the flood, Noah made a sacrifice, which Yahweh accepted, and everything was forgiven. And this is important in Israelite religious thinking, because it was crucial that any sins be expiated and quickly. Otherwise, the community will be contaminated going forward. So after the flood, humanity got a fresh start. So there's no basis for any continuing original sin if it was that influencing humanity going forward. If we have a minute, I can go into the Christian co-option of that. Do we have a minute for that?
You know what? I think I'm going to have to cut it off here. We're about done. Save that for next time, my friend. Really fascinating stuff. We've been talking to Arthur
That's
George.
fine.
He's written a book called The Mythology of Eden. I will ask you: have you gotten further into the New Testament? Have you mostly concentrated on Old Testament mythology, or are you tackling some of the Christ myth theory that's around?
Yeah, I think for the Old Testament Hebrew Bible stuff, I think I've done enough of that for a while in terms of writing anything about it. I continue to do speeches and stuff like that, and I do keep referring back as I need to. But I am doing a lot of research on the New Testament material, and the Christ myth theory is part of that. I'm actually not as interested in whether Jesus did in fact exist. For me, it doesn't matter too much whether 95% of the Gospels are myth or 100%. I mean, I'm more interested in how the myths work, why they got adopted, why the mythology and Christianity succeeded as it did, taking into account the psychological factors and the competing religions. And
Thanks a lot, Arthur George. We are down to our last 15 seconds. Thanks for joining us, and we will talk to you soon.
Very good. Right. Thanks a lot.
Who's the next guest, Antonio?
Next week will be Minas Papageorgiou, founder of Greek Mythicists.